essentially the rise of George Wallace and this quote, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but this quote of his from 1964, which I'm going to paraphrase, was being a Southerner is not geographic. It's a philosophy. It's a philosophy and an attitude.
Right.
I mean, that is, that sums it up. I mean, he got it right, and that was 60 years ago. And I mean, the durability of that quote is nuts.
Yeah, George Wallace is a little bit of a political genius, really. I mean, that's not to say I have any respect for his positions,
right?
But the guy knew how to build political power. My favorite quote about Wallace was somebody who said he could have parachuted into the Albanian countryside in the middle of the Cold War, and he would have been running the Comintern in 3 seasons. He just knew how to make things happen politically, and that vision that Wallace country was the entire nation, he laid out in his 1963 inaugural address. When it's a very famous address because he said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And this was the rallying cry for segregationists throughout the South to fight back against federal intervention in civil rights. But if you look at that speech more closely, he only uses segregation one at a time for a total of 4 invocations of segregation. He mentions freedom or liberty 24 times. It's saturated with the idea of freedom, that, tyranny is clanking upon the South and the chains are rattling and we need to fight and the federal bayonets are on the horizon. And so he knows that screaming about race is only going to get him so far. That's going to get him a lot of traction with the real racists. But screaming about the federal government is going to bring in the racists, and it's going to bring in the tax cut types, the deregulation types, the anti-statist types for whatever reason. And he's got a coalition. Who doesn't hate the federal government? Everybody's got a beef against the federal government. And so that really provides him traction. And that's how he really came to win the governor's office as the fighting judge of Barber County, because he fought the federal government after the 1958 Civil Rights Act when they wanted the voting rolls for Barber County. He said he wouldn't give them to him. And so that's actually how he came to power, was fighting federal government.
That construction really, I mean, I see it a lot, I feel like, today, not just the freedom thing, like in the context of free speech, right? Like we see this, there is this sort of sense on the right, and in addition to the idea that there's this a philosophical and sort of an attitudinal, we're of the South, but it's not, it's not a geographic thing. It is right. It is simply a list of signifiers that we subscribe to, but that we see that now, like with free speech absolutism, it feels like on some level, which is sort of just a derivation of that freedom. Like it is, we use segregation as an example, but it's really not just limited to segregation, even though that is really what we really want is this one dynamic to suppress others. But it's the same construction, it seems to me, with so-called free speech. The idea that like people are railing against the authoritarianism in, people should use pronouns that people should want to use, or that the dynamic is similar. It seems to me.
I'm not quite sure which angle you're going at.
Well,
this with
the use of that. We don't hear that freedom is now sort of like that same dynamic exists, but it is in the form of like free speech absolutism, let's say. And the word tyranny is replaced with authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. And the idea in that dynamic of you need to be tolerant of our intolerance type of situation is the sort of flavor of this same dynamic that we see today. Well,
again, I guess, I personally, I don't care what anybody wants, like, the lack of tolerance seems to be digging in on all sides, right? Right, left, center, everybody's digging their ramparts and building the ramparts up deeper rather than just sort of, for me, I kind of don't care about that stuff nearly as much as I care about the right to vote and
Right.
the right to a fair wage and the right, like core values. And I think all of this stuff prevents us from talking about more fundamental questions. And Wallace knew that too. He was actually originally kind of a progressive. He wanted to build roads. He wanted to build trade schools for people. And then he realized, what people want to do is hate each other. And I can whip that up. And it doesn't matter what tool I pick up, whether it's, what you want to be called or he loved to make fun of how people dressed or whatever, make fun of hippies and things like this. He was very funny about it, actually. And that all of that stuff pushes people, you can mobilize that. And he would fail continually on everything he tried, but he always failed forward, because if you're fighting the federal government, you've got an infinite fight. You can always go to the barricades on that fight. And so he sort of understood that even his own political proclivities, which tended to be more progressive Southern, would fail in the face of this sort of divisive kinds of hatred.
Well, let me ask you this, because you've made a great case about how this is uniquely American, how Southern ideology is, it's not just being from the South, it's not just regional, as Wallace said. It is a way of life. It's an ideology. But we're seeing some of this play out internationally, right? Like a lot of what you describe, reminds me of Israel-Palestine. In Brazil, we're seeing this kind of conception of freedom play out, even though in Brazil they have a different structure in the way that they conceive rights. Like we had an interview with Brian Muir, who talked about how in Brazil it's not a Bill of Rights, but it's meant to be a balancing act, the harmony of human rights. So you can't have freedom if it takes away from somebody else's freedom, which we have less of a tradition of in the United States. And yet, so many of these patterns that you describe are enduring and international. So what do you make of that?
No, well, so we can bring the conversation all the way back to the beginning when we were talking about Orlando Patterson. And he basically says this is a problem with freedom itself. The entire Western construct of freedom that gets exported around the world is actually connected to this problem, right? And so you guys have nailed it on the head that it's not just an American problem, even though, Wallace understood the power of it on the American stage, the entire country, not just the South. But so if we see the seeds of this idea of freedom being spread throughout the world, it takes hold in different forms. And what's particularly interesting about the American South or the United States in general, that makes it particularly compelling and unique, is that it's a settler colonial society, right? People took over the land and lived there. And it's a chattel slavery society. And we don't very often see both of those. Brazil is another case where we see a similar dynamic, but the degree to which the United States has both of those makes it, I think, a particularly powerful representation of this. So powerful that it also gets doubled down and exported, right? So, what we've seen in Brazil lately is a kind of a replica of what happened in the United States on January 6th. And in Israel, I think much the same. So I guess I'm trying to make the case that it's a problem with freedom itself, and that's why I'm not just saying it's the rhetoric of freedom. I'm saying it's freedom.
Is it freedom within colonial countries, right? Countries
Especially,
built
right.
on colonized. I mean, because you can see that there's, with those examples that we're just describing, that is a clear delineation from other countries, maybe of similar background.
Right. So there might be a tradition of freedom, say as in England or France. France, it's obviously, connected with some fraternité and égalité too. But that was going to be exactly where I was going, is that when you see it let loose in this colonial sphere, and you see it with the land grab plus possession of other human beings, and your freedom to do both of those things, it really kind of almost metastasizes this Western idea that we're struggling with here in the American context.
I want to I want to talk about some of the pushback that we saw from activists, within the context of Barber County, but I just want to return to sort of what I was talking about, that dynamic, because it seems to me, if Wallace was right, that this is not no longer about a geographic and all of the material implications of what comes along with a geographic identification, right? And also the temporal issues that are associated with that. We're not dispossessing members of Creek Nation at the moment, and we don't have chattel slavery, but it's become a philosophy and an attitude. This, it seems to me at different times, right? And I think in your book, you're highlighting times where there's sort of specific types of material implications to this philosophy. But as that philosophy gets nationalized and it can't be applied in the same way, is not like, and I bring up trans stuff only because, we have 150 bills in 25 states right now that are directly implicated in trans care. And if I had to bet, without looking at those 25 states, there is no doubt in my mind that every state that had the highest number of slaves in a list are included in those 25 states. And and that this sort of round of what we're seeing in terms of transphobia was, in many ways, has its roots to a letter from the Obama administration, to schools saying, don't forget, this is, I think it was Title IX. This is the way that bathrooms are, people can go to the bathrooms that they're identified with in schools. And 9 years later, 10 years later, it has got to the point where there is massive legislation. And that's the dynamic that seems to me to be like the same dynamic. It's just that we're going to apply it in different areas. It may be the IRS one day, but it's always nice to have a marginalized community that we can all agree their rights don't.
That's right.
Because what's the infringement associated with trans people? It really, there's nothing.
There's not that much.
but it is this notion of that dynamic, which seems to me to be going on there.
Yeah. And when you bring together a sort of traditionalism of any form that's fighting against federal authority, you've got a dynamic relationship, and that's what you're seeing. That you just described that perfectly. Whether these kind of crazy fights that we're seeing all over on these questions, and my book is in essence an argument against states' rights and in favor of vigorous federal enforcement of important social and political questions. Now, what other people say is, well, wait, what about local traditions? What about our way of life? What about we know best? We're the laboratories of democracy. Well, that's not really how history plays out. That all tends to be euphemistic for social control over embattled peoples. And federal government is the only real leverage that a lot of those folks have.